Welcome to the Hay Kings podcast, brought to you by Vermeer, your expert in hay and forage equipment. Today on the Hay Kings podcast, I'm joined by Gary Campbell. One of the reasons that we got talking was about equipment design, and from what you just told us, you're probably one of the experts in the hay world, in the baler world, and we can keep it to bales. What other aspects go into the design of the baler that might not be optimal for every condition?
I'm of the view that the term expert gets bandied around a lot these days, whereas I feel like if you haven't done 50 years at a subject, you're still learning. So like anything I'm saying is just, it's my experience, what I've seen. But I think one of the biggest things that maybe the end user doesn't realize is that there's massive variations in the ag industry. Like I say, a guy in Germany wants throughput, a guy in Italy who happens to ship overseas wants density. A guy in Canterbury, New Zealand is dealing with grass seed straw that's really skinny and 4 foot long, which is different to an Irish farmer who's dealing with third cut grass that's really, really wet and short. And the designer is trying to appease all of those people with the same machine. Like there's a bell curve of users. There's the guys who do 1,000 bales a year. There's the guys that do 20,000 bales a year. And then in the middle, there's the guys that do like 5,000, and they represent the majority of users. So you're trying to appease all of them. And that's the end user. And then you've got differences like the Germans they've got a drawbar that hooks on just below the top. The Americans don't have pickup hitches. The French guys have low hitches. The Kiwis have got a mixture of whatever got imported to the country. So you're trying to appease all them. You've got all the isobus standards. So you've got a guy who wants to run a class baler on a case tractor so the isobus works, but then case update their software and the isobus falls over. And although there's a standard, it's not really adhered to that strongly. So that's always changing. The tractors are constantly changing. I did a lot of work with fertilizer spreaders for a few years, and for instance, the Fendt tractors, they've got like dual 140 litre pumps on them or something, which is just, if the user hasn't taken the time to set up the flow of the hydraulics, they end up cooking the back end of the fert spreader. But no other tractor on the market at the time I was doing it had that capability. So the Fendt users would throw up a different set of problems to the John Deere users, and a lot of stuff happened there. And then I guess you get into the internal customers, I guess. So whether, as a designer, you've got the farmer or the contractor is your end customer, but you've got on the shop floor, you'd have like a laser cutting department that cuts the steel into the shapes. He's one of your customers and he's got his own wants and needs. Like, for instance, you can't laser cut a hole through steel that's smaller than the thickness of the plate. So that's one set of parameters. You've got a factory manager who's trying to minimize component count, because every time you've got an extra component, it's another part on the shelf, it's another part number, it's another thing to be moved around, it's another update to the parts book, it's another update to the user manual.
Inventory carrying costs.
Oh, for sure. Like, yeah, if you can use a 30 mil shaft and get away with it, as opposed to designing a new 35 millimeter shaft, you're going to try and use a 30 mil shaft because it's on the shelf already. You've used it before. The machine shop's spitting out 100 at a time. It's cheaper. You've got the sales guys who they are all, well, in my opinion, they're always looking for the new shiny feature, whether that be, I don't know, let's look at the balers. You've got the hydraulic lowering twine boxes are on the market these days. Or I remember I got told by a head of design, if you put an option on a baler, the Germans will spec it. It's just whatever it is in that marketplace, the Germans love options. So they'll have a steering axle, they'll have suspension axle, they'll have hydraulic folding tailgate, bale ejector, lowering twine boxes. And maybe they make a difference to throughput or user comfort, but they're not really that big an innovation. But if you put them on the list, those customers will option up, and it gives you an advantage over the competitor. So they're pushing for new features, new wants. And then the elephant in the room that a lot of people don't really acknowledge is the dealers don't make much money on the actual sale of the equipment. Their margins are pretty tight. It's the after sales and the part supply and the service is where they make their money. So you could very well make a square baler that's going to last 100 years. It would weigh 50 ton and suck about 1,000 horsepower. But you could do it. But it's not going to be financially viable for the company that's manufacturing it. The dealer's not going to have to do any service. The dealer's going to serve no parts. So it's just this eternal balancing act of keeping the factory happy, keeping the dealerships happy, and the customer. And you're just trying to juggle all this at once.
If you have a large producer, somebody that's putting 20,000 bales on a big baler in a year, and they start to have problems, what is the company's response to that? How do you think through that thought process from the manufacturer's side to respond to somebody that's using the machine, maybe properly taking care of it, but like you said, somebody that is really using that machine to its full capacity versus somebody that does half the volume and gets several years out of that baler?
Coming at it from a design point of view, you would go and you talk to your warranty claims manager within your company and go, hey, we've got this customer that snapped 5 shafts. He keeps doing it. And he's jumping up and down and screaming, wanting it to get fixed. How many of our customers have this problem? And the warranty manager will go through and go, hang on, we've actually never seen this issue before. We're not sure what's happening. At that point, you start going, is this customer doing something different? Are they running 100 horsepower more on front? Are they baling something weird that we haven't seen before? Are they just being a bit rough with it? Or are they just pushing the machine beyond what it was intended to do? You end up having to make a pretty hard decision going, I'm sorry, but you're an outlier. It's not financially suitable for us to try and fix it for you. Because if we made that shaft 40 mil thick, it's going to cost us more money, but nobody else needs it apart from this one customer. So you're just like juggling all of these different parameters, trying to keep the machine at a sensible price that can suit most people. I think it depends on who you are. Like, because I grew up on a farm and I've done all the time driving, I'm aware that a broken shaft isn't just a broken shaft. You know, it's not just $100 for a new shaft. It's 2 days missed baling. It's 100 acres on the ground and a rainstorm coming in. Like it actually goes beyond that. So you get put into a really awkward position. And it used to really like get under my skin having to make those decisions because I could see where the company was coming from. But as a farm boy, I was like, I don't agree with this. So it put you into a hard position sometimes. I've also seen people sit down and do real rough, just envelope calculations. This warranty costs us $1,000 per machine. We have a 1% warranty rate. A fix is going to cost us $10,000. It's just cheaper to keep warranting it. So those conversations happen too, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I can see why they happen. And then you've also got some users are just in really strange places. I remember we were baling in northern Italy, and we were working with I think might be Durham wheat. It's the wheat they use for pasta anyway. There was dust and material buildup around the back of the knotters, and it would build up until the point where the needles would come up and they would bend because they couldn't get through this buildup. And I was working with a very well respected big baler designer, and he was just like, I've never seen this before. I've been a farm boy, I was an apprentice mechanic, I've worked up to now I'm head of design of big square balers, and I've never seen this issue before that only ever presented itself in one particular area of Italy. So when you come up against stuff like that, it's almost impossible to design for it, you know? It happens in one place in the world. Nowhere else had that issue.
I'm Tom Swin, and I switched to the Vermeer TM1410 trailed mower. The biggest impact is capacity. We're just getting more hay mowed. It's hard not to be impressed by 20-foot mowing and how much you can get mowed in a couple of hours. We went from 5 acres an hour to 12, 14 acres an hour real easily with this. And that's why I switched to the Vermeer TM 1410 trailed mower.
Hear the full story at makeandhay.com/haykings.
You said the golden age of machinery has passed, as the age of technology for technology's sake has reared its head. Take me through that thought process.
Yeah, I look back, because we were a small farm back home, we were always running second-hand machinery. So like we had like 2140 John Deeres, like Deeres from like the sort of early 90s. We always looked at the older stuff, and I always felt like the old machinery was just cool. You know, a guy would go out and he'd build it and he'd just go and field test it for a year to break it. I don't think there was not as much corporations. Like Harry Ferguson, for example, he actually grew up about 20 miles from where I'm from. One of his early tractors, you could fix it with 2 spanners. Like every bolt on that tractor was 2 different sizes.
Harry Ferguson, famous for Massey Ferguson, right?
Yeah, like the Harry Ferguson, yeah. His early stuff, you could fix it with a double-ended spanner. And because he had that thought process that he knew the farmer wanted to fix it and make it simple. Maybe like the 70s, 80s, you could just have a bit of a crazy idea and you go and build it and try it. Whereas nowadays you have in my experience, you have a pretty out there idea and you go and present it to, I don't know, the finance director or the CEO, and they're like, oh, that's a bit risky, it's all known, we haven't done it before. And they're just a bit more hesitant. And then, so I don't think there's as much push from innovation, probably from the big players, like your John Deere, your Massey, AGCO, like they're a massive corporation. And at the end of the day, they're there to make a profit. So I don't think they're going to do anything too crazy. Whereas I feel like back in the 70s and 80s, it was a bit freer. So that's kind of one side of that. And then the other thing, mechanical engineering, there's a lot more tools at our disposal nowadays, like computer design, FEA stress testing and stuff. So they're allowing people to be a lot more informed of their designs. And like in the past, I've had pieces of equipment where you do all your calculations, you run it through the computer, blah, blah, blah. And it says, oh, yep, if we make this out of free mill steel, it'll be more than strong enough. And you prototype it and look at it and go, the computer says it's going to be okay, but in the back of my head, there's 18-year-old Gary trying to get home to go to the pub, and he's going to break that. And you kind of know that even though the calculations are right, there's like the farmer fudge factor, we used to call it. Like you've got to try and make it bigger than it needs to be, because you just know, like, there's no way that I've come across to computer simulate a 300 horsepower tractor to its axles in mud with a baler with 2 bales in the chamber buried up to the axles, and then maybe like a quad track on the front trying to drag it out. Like you cannot simulate that kind of stuff. It's really hard to get that back into the design process if you haven't been there and you haven't seen it.
That gives about the best mental picture that you could come up with.
We've been there, like I've seen it, and it's what happens. There's probably a bit of a loss in the industry. There's not as many people nowadays who've like walked the walk, I guess. They've maybe done their engineering degree and they've ended up for John Deere. Have they ever sat in a tractor? Have they ever driven one? I would doubt it. I mean, there's a lot of guys out there who have come up from the shop floor or the dealership, or they've been a tractor driver or whatever. But I don't think there's as much knowledge in the industry as maybe there once was. I think that's probably a symptom of a much wider problem. I'm not sure what's like in America. It's one of the reasons why I actually chose to move to New Zealand, where like the ag sector is actually respected. So in the UK, I went to a fairly well-regarded school. And as soon as I opened my mouth and said, I want to do farming or agriculture or whatever, they were just like, nah, you want to go and be a doctor, or you want to go and be a lawyer, or like the sort of high-end jobs. I don't think there's many people out there as well who are encouraged in the industry. So there's a real brain drain happening too. So we've looked around in previous jobs. We've been trying to find a new designer or a new field test engineer, and they're not out there. Whereas I'd say 30, 40 years ago, it was still a respected, interesting industry. I don't think people realize just how up to date and complicated some of the modern machinery is. So although I say I feel the golden age is gone, that is very much from a personal, I don't see the crazy out there contraptions being built anymore. Some of the Ford tractors back in the day were really forward thinking, and the class guys in Germany were building, crazy balers on tracks and all sorts of things. So I feel like that stuff's gone away, which I consider the really interesting, cool stuff. But the technology and the machinery, that's definitely made leaps and bounds. The GPS, the sensors, the automation, the hydraulics, like they've all very much in their golden age. Quite a different way of looking at it. I think although the machinery is super complicated and up to date, the opportunity to really push the boundaries is probably gone. Does that make sense?
It's my opinion that our business models suffer from all of those exact same things. The profitability engines that would bring somebody to agriculture are suffering from brain drains, are suffering from maybe a lack of coolness. You're talking about struggling to find engineers with an ag background. I think we struggle to find businessmen with an ag background in agriculture in general. In my part of the world, if you're doing 1,000 acres of hay, that's probably enough to live off of. If you're doing a couple thousand acres of wheat, that's probably enough to live off of. If you're doing irrigated hay in central Washington state, maybe 1,500, 2,000 acres is enough to support yourself and several hired men kind of scale. To get there now is hard. To get to that scale, to get to that level of business acumen, to run a farm big enough to live off of. We're suffering from all those same problems where we have a brain drain where the most talented people, maybe they do go to be doctors and lawyers. Maybe it just isn't cool enough to stay a farmer. Maybe it is a respect thing. Maybe it's the way society looks at agriculture. I don't have a good answer, but I don't think we have, to your point, the engineers, and to my point, the business owners in agriculture that we need.
No, I think the industry is 100% suffering from a coolness issue. I'm always of the opinion that New Zealand kind of maybe like 20 years behind the UK in terms of like culture stuff. Like when I was a teenager, early 20s in the UK, like if you were out at a bar or a nightclub or something, like chatting up a girl and it comes to subject like, oh yeah, I'm off a farm, I'm studying agricultural engineering. You could just see them almost sort of begin to look down at you a bit and go, oh, like a farmer, oh, like that's a bit not beneath me, but like it wasn't seen as being an attractive, interesting thing to do. But then it came down to New Zealand, and the rural-urban divide in this country is, Kiwi farmers will say it's a big thing, but I'll say, coming from overseas, that it's non-existent in New Zealand almost. I've got like a bunch of my peers, in their early 30s are working for dairy co-ops, they're working for dairy plant manufacturers, dealerships, rural insurance brokers. I know 3 or 4 people who did like their degrees in finance and are now rural bankers. There's still very much the focus on that industry down here. But I think overseas, certainly in Europe anyway, it's seen as a rural backwards industry that no one really wants to jump into. And at the end of the day, like I'm always a little bit wary when farmers jump up and down and say like I'm the hardest working person in the world. I feel like that's a little bit not quite true. But farming has got a massive set of demands on it. It's very time heavy. Like you're tied to that farm. You can't really get away from it because of stock, or you're trying to get the ground covered. So if you're a really good businessman, you're not really going to want to stay on a farm because you can go and do something else, get paid way better, get paid more, work less hours, and probably be better off for it. Like I would love to be back on the farm working, but it's not a reality from the land that's in my family or the price you got to pay for land these days, like to have enough to be viable, which then you can kind of kick back and go, why on earth does someone have to have 1,000 acres to make enough money to live on? Are the supermarkets pushing the prices down through the floor? Is there, I know there's a raft of different reasons you can look at as to why it's what it is. But I feel like the farm industry is probably the bottom of the chain. They're always struggling to make ends meet. So it's not a very attractive sector to want to walk into. I mean, like nowadays, I've actually been out of the industry for probably 2 years now, I've actually moved into like science R&D, and it was just I've driven tractors since I was like 16 professionally. Got paid for it, did it for a job. Never really had a summer. Was always working long hours. Went into field testing again, long hours, and I was finding that there wasn't any work-life balance. I wasn't getting out to see the girlfriend. I wasn't seeing my mates. I wasn't getting to do any sports and hobbies. So after 15 years of that, I was like, look, I need to go and do something different for a while. But if I could get back into farming with a healthy balance, I'd love to do it. But I don't see a way to do it at the minute. I think that's a problem for the industry.
Is there anything that can be done about it? I have the same observations, and I've worked the same hours trying to put together a farm, and it's really hard. What would you say to somebody that was trying to do it, or is there a fix to this? There's more questions here than answers, and I don't have the answers.
No real answers jump out at me. I think it's a bigger systematic problem. I think if we get the general public more engaged in where their food comes from, like I see a lot of, I think it's pretty much worldwide at the minute, but there's this whole vegetarianism and veganism movement. And if you don't want to eat an animal because you don't want to kill an animal, like that's fine. I don't care. Like that's up to you, whatever. But it's becoming this over like environmental issue. And I think the bigger conversation needs to happen is people need to be aware of like food miles. Like I'd happily eat local food and pay a bit more for it rather than, I don't know what it's like over where you guys are, but we've got like fruit and veg getting shipped in from Argentina, or we're getting pork shipped in from China because it's $1 cheaper per kilo, so the supermarket can make an extra $1 per kilo profit. And if we address those things and looked at getting food produced locally, it might start pushing the price back up, and people can afford to run 100 acres and make a bit of money off that rather than needing to make 1,000 and then having to run 1,000 acres with like 2 staff members because you can't afford to pay more than 2 staff members. So I think there's a bigger systematic issue that needs to be addressed before the farming becomes profitable again. I also reckon that there's a lot of guys out there, and this might piss some people off, but I think there's a lot of guys out there who are farming or contracting who don't really understand the numbers behind what they're doing. Like I've got guys back home who I know like working on a farm, but they're not getting a salary. They've got a roof over their head and food on the table, but they're not actually accounting for their time. So if you come into it with a strong business mind and you're not willing to work for free and smash yourself in to the ground working every hour of the day without getting paid for it, you're competing against guys who don't really care and they don't know any better. So I think the whole industry needs to become a bit more professional as well.
It's always nice to have these exchange of ideas and thoughts, and maybe we help somebody understand a little bit why that baler doesn't work exactly the way they hope for in their situation.
It's been cool.